Okay, this is Andrew Gallimore's Alien Information Theory, Part 6. We are on Chapter 13. I think there was something I wanted to say at the front, but I kind of forget. Be that as it may, this is for educational purposes only. There is no medical, legal, or any other type of information promulgated here or provided here or propagated here. Um, and as such, let's get into the text. We got chapter 13, the mechanism of interdimensional communication. Rectangles within rectangles, apparently. Another Terence McKenna quote. What happens is the world is completely replaced instantly, 100%. It's all gone. And what's put in its place? Not one iota of what's put in its place was taken from this world. So it's a 100% reality channel switch. End quote. I wonder if this is where he says nothing lasts, but nothing is lost. But, it's a name of a whole Spangle album, actually. In radio communications, the term channel switch refers to the shift from receiving an input signal from at one particular radio frequency band to another. A simple crystal radio tuner, for example, uses a capacitor to modulate a tuning coil to resonate with and amplify a particular frequency of electromagnetic wave whilst ignoring the others. Excuse me. As the tuner is shifted to a new frequency, reception of the original signal is lost as the new one begins to crackle through the speakers. The radio tuner modulates the flow of electricity through the tuning coil so that it can receive the information embedded in the new frequency. Analogously, DMT modulates the flow of information through the brain such that it loses the ability to receive information from the consensus world, from our dimensional slice, but gains the ability to receive information from the normally hidden orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid, experienced as the DMT hyperspace. This complete switch of the phenomenal world from consensus reality to the DMT hyperspace has two specific requirements. One, information from the orthogonal dimensions of the hypercube must be gated into the brain. Two, this orthogonal information must modulate by being matched to the ongoing intrinsic information being generated by the brain complex such that the phenomenal DMT world is built. Remember, the construction of a phenomenal world by the brain is not a passive process. Your phenomenal world is always built from intrinsic information with extrinsic sensory information only modulating this information by being matched to it. This applies under all circumstances, including a DMT trip. DMT doesn't transfer your consciousness from the consensus world to the DMT world, but rather DMT causes your brain to cease building the consensus world and start building the DMT world. But for the brain to achieve this, it's not enough that it can receive information from these orthogonal dimensions. Requirement one, This information must successfully modulate the intrinsic information generated by the brain complex, which means the intrinsic information must change so that it matches this information from the orthogonal dimensions. Requirement 2, see page 123. Um, we already read that earlier in an earlier part. DMT has a crucial role in both of these processes. What in the world is this? It looks like a sad face. Drooling, maybe? Drooling sad face? I don't know. During waking life, a during waking life in the consensus world, information enters the brain complex from within our dimensional slice through the normal sensory apparatus. This is well understood, although it's helpful to remind ourselves of what's actually going on. Light, sound, and other sensory stimuli are, in fact, patterns of information interacting with another extremely complex pattern of information known as your brain. Your sense organs are highly evolved structures that are optimized for receiving certain patterns of information from this dimensional slice and feeding them into specific areas of your brain complex for further processing. Obviously the information received from the orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid during a DMT trip is not received through these sensory conduits, and it would be wrong to assume that information transfer into the brain can only occur using the usual sensory apparatus. If I were to strike you hard enough on the head, you might well see flashes of light. This is not from light information or even stimulation of your retina but because the rattling of your brain inside your skull altered the information it generates, but because the rattling of your brain inside your skull altered the information it generates. Information transfer occurred not via the senses, but by direct stimulation of the brain, albeit in a rather uncontrolled manner. To understand how DMT allows information from orthogonal dimensions to enter the brain, we must let go of the assumption that the familiar sensory routes are the only means of information transfer into the brain complex. The three phases of entry into the DMT reality, breaking through, quote unquote, can be broken down into three phases. One, bottom-up modulation, activation phase. Two, top-down modulation, gating phase. Three, trans-dimensional informational feedback loop, lock phase. Uh, the three phases of entry into the DMT space. Activation phase. During normal waking life in the consensus world, your brain generates the intrinsic information that constitutes your phenomenal world. Extrinsic information from outside the brain received via the senses modulates this ongoing intrinsic activity such that a stable, predictable, and adaptive phenomenal world is built. When DMT enters the brain, it binds to and activates the 5-HT2A receptors embedded in the membrane of the cortical pyramidal cells. The effect of this is to initiate a sequence of reactions and interactions inside the pyramidal cell. Since all of these effects are occurring at the molecular level, this is a sideways information flow with the information generated by the DMT molecule binding to the 5H2A, uh, 5HT2A receptor flowing into the network of molecules inside the neuron. However, since this network possesses emergent properties, such as the ability to regulate the membrane potential of the neuron, the information also flows upwards, causing the membrane potential to rise toward the threshold potential. This is the depolarizing effect of 5-HT2A receptor stimulation and occurs in pyramidal cells across the cortex. The pyramidal neurons form part of the highly complex emergent system that generates the patterns of intrinsic information, T states, that constitute your phenomenal world. And this particular adjustment to their membrane potential by DMT causes that pattern of information to change. Your world begins to change. This is an upwards flow of information from the molecular level to the cortical network and phenomenal world level. From For most psychedelic drugs, which each with their own effects on the pattern of intrinsic information generated by the cortical network. This is the end of the story. The change in the pattern of intrinsic information is the change in the world generated by the drug, the psychedelic effect. However, with DMT, this is only the beginning. This phase is the initial activation of the brain by modulating the information it generates. Gating phase. All psychedelic drugs affect the intrinsic information generated by the cortex in their own particular way. Usually, the effect can be likened to a kind of loosening, quote unquote, of the information, such that the phenomenal world becomes more fluid and unpredictable than the normal waking world. This is achieved by expanding the repertoire of T states to include entirely novel states. DMT, however, exerts a more specific effect. Rather than simply rendering the information more random, DMT shifts the intrinsic information from one pattern, the consensus world pattern, to another pattern, the DMT world pattern. See page 123. This is more analogous to switching a channel to an entirely different frequency than to nudging the dial slightly out of tune. However, this channel switch does not explain how information from the orthogonal dimensions can access the brain. To explain this, we must return to the idea of downwards information flow, which occurs when high-level information selects from a lower-level state space. Pause. DMT elicits a highly specific pattern of information from the activity of the cortical system. Assuming the dosage is sufficient to surpass the initially disorderly activation phase, the information becomes, quote, hyper structured, end quote. The DMT user will notice characteristic DMT patterns and motifs when entering this phase, extremely complex and almost impossible to describe, but unquestionably, quote, DMT-esque, end quote, in their form. This hyperstructured uh, information flows down to the level of the grid itself, selecting specific patterns of cells that we have referred to as perturbation brain patterns. See Chapter 11. These DMT elicit cell configurations only emerge within the brain complex in the presence of this particular psychedelic molecule and are mapped to the rule sets that allow 4+ uh, I already forget what the I stands for. Input cell states to emerge. So overall, the information generated during the phage, activation phase flows to the level of the hypergrid and gates the flow of information from the orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid. without the brackets, into the brain complex. Here we go with the orthogonal stuff, brain perturbation, brain pattern, DMT state, downwards information flow, perturbation, brain pattern adopted, pink, which is, you can barely see it in this like middle square, which gets down to here, pattern rule mapping, grid, hypergrid. 4 plus input cell states, blue, gate the flow of information from orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid. I guess since it's not all of it's not coming down, like only some of it's coming down, that would mean that it's gated, perhaps. I don't know if I'm reading this illustration correctly, but normal waking state, intrinsic information builds the consensus phenomenal world. In this way, I suppose, but then you have sensory matching, information grid, matching this pattern to this pattern, I guess. In the normal waking state, the thalamocortical system builds the consensus world as a model of the grid, modulated by extrinsic information from the grid, sensory matching. DMT state, DMT modulated intrinsic information builds hyperspace. Uh, yeah, it's sort of different. Yeah. Sensory matching information from hypergrid matches to this, but not quite. This bond doesn't seem to be over here, but I don't know. The rest of the pattern seems correct, unless, I don't know. DMT perturbs the activity of the thalamocortical system such that it ceases to build the consensus world but begins to build the DMT hyperspace as a model of the hypergrid, modulated by information from its orthogonal dimensions. A lock phase. DMT binding to the 5-HT2A receptor doesn't open a magical portal to another dimension. It causes a specific pattern of activity, information, to be generated by the thalamocortical networks. This high level information then flows downwards to the level of the hyper in brackets grid, selecting cell state patterns, brain perturbation patterns that allow information to be received from its orthogonal dimensions. The information received from the orthogonal dimensions then begins to flow upwards in the usual way through the molecular and neuronal levels up to the cortical network level, further modulating cortical activity and the information generated by the cortical networks. So information is flowing in both directions, downwards from the cortical level to the level of the hyper in brackets grid, and upward from the hyper in brackets grid to the cortex. I don't think I have to keep saying brackets. But whatever. Of course, there is nothing unusual about information flowing in both directions through the layers of a complex system. The difference here is that the DMT modulated high level information generated by the cortex as a unique effect at the level of the hypergrid, owing to the pattern rule mappings, which actually gate the flow of information from the hypergrid. A brain complex is special in that the complex emergent information that it generates is highly flexible and dynamic, allowing information transfer from the orthogonal dimensions to the hypergrid to modulate the intrinsic activity being generated by the brain complex in real time. Of course, this means that the information flowing downwards from the cortical level to the hypergrid is also altered. The top-down effect of this new modulated information is more efficient at generating the perturbation patterns at the level of the hypergrid to further enhance information transfer from its orthogonal dimensions. This information flows up the hierarchy to the level of the cortex and so on. So a positive feedback loop emerges with information from the orthogonal dimensions modulating cortical information such that the transfer of information from those dimensions is enhanced, allowing them to further modulate cortical information. This information feedback loop eventually locks, quote unquote, the cortex into the state in which it is most efficient at receiving information from the orthogonal uh, dimensions and constructing the phenomenal world experienced as hyperspace. Prior to this stage, there is an experience of confusion, disorientation, and a flurry of highly complex imagery and influx of information, and only when the lock phase is achieved does this stabilize. This is the breakthrough. For this phase to be reached, however, the activity of the cortical system in the presence of DMT must be such that the information flowing upwards to the cortical level can be absorbed by the cortical networks. Remember, just as normal sensory information can only be absorbed by the brain if it matches its ongoing intrinsic activity, so it is with information from the hypergrid. And in the presence of DMT, the modified intrinsic activity is matched to the information being received from the hypergrid, whilst the brain loses the ability to absorb information via the normal sensory apparatus, which can then modulate cortical activity as the brain begins to build a stable model of the hypergrid, which is experienced as the breakthrough into hyperspace. Crucially, the effect of DMT on cortical activity is determined by its connectivity, and since the thalamocortical connectivity varies between individuals, some people might be more or less sensitive to the transdimensional gating effects of DMT, with a small portion, with a small proportion never progressing beyond the activation phase. Man, I'm having trouble with these words. What the heck? However, assuming the lock phase is successfully reached and stabilized, the brain complex is no longer restricted to our usual dimensional slice of the hypergrid. The brain re-emerges from the hypergrid as the hyperdimensional brain complex, and the trigger becomes part of that higher dimensional reality. This is when the elves welcome you home. I wonder when Temple talking about Nikola Tesla, of how and Tesla, by his own admission, would have these flashes of light and stuff of that nature without, presumably without any experience with DMT or any other drug that I know of. I haven't looked into Tesla, but he's admitted to having these weird experiences of flashes of light and other things. So I wonder if that has any tie into it. Obviously, he wasn't uh, tra- um, transported to the hypergrid or anything, but I wonder if it's like a different kind of phenomenon. I don't know. Seems kind of interesting though. Um, it's important to note that the two distinct but overlapping roles of DMT in this process. One, DMT perturbs cortical activity to generate the perturbation brain patterns at the level of the grid. Initial dimensional gating. Two, the DMT perturbed cortical activity also allows the brain to absorb the information from the hypergrid as it flows to the cortical level. Orthogonal dimension going down, this is going upwards. Information flows. Orthogonal. Wait, it said orthogonal up here. Hmm. Unfortunately, or fortunately, this state doesn't last forever. After only a few minutes, the DMT levels drop below a threshold, and serotonin, which is essentially competing with DMT at the receptor site, again floods the 5-HT2A receptors. In the presence of serotonin, the pyramidal neurons are returned to their basal uh, basal activation level, and this reverses DMT's effects on cortical activity. The brain begins generating the same patterns of information as before DMT was ingested, and the hyperstructured downward flowing information generated by the brain in the presence of DMT is no longer generated in its absence. As such, the positive feedback loop is broken and the brain loses access to the orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid. Feedback loops often tend to show switching behavior, shifting rapidly from an inactive to a fully active state, and vice versa. This is why the transition from the DMT space uh, back to consensus reality is often abrupt. You might feel as if you are suddenly jolted back into the consensus world, shaking, awestruck, and grateful for the most horrifyingly beautiful and astonishing experience ever you could never have imagined. Information flowing from the orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid C gating phase flows upwards and modulates information at the cortical level. This modulated information flows downwards to the level of the hyper in brackets grid, further enhancing the selection of brain perturbation patterns and establishing a positive feedback loop that locks the brain complex in the DMT space. We're already up to chapter 14. I wonder, they talk about uh, obviously um, those who talk about this DMT lockout phase is not the same thing as obviously as what Gallimore is saying here as the lock phase. The lockout phase apparently, um, uh, I don't know this firsthand, but apparently if you try to take too much DMT, you apparently get locked out, as in you're not allowed into the hyperspace. So I wonder if that's like kind of like serotonin taking over a lot quicker to lock people out of the DMT hyperspace. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on it, but it's a possibility perhaps. I don't know. Anyways, we're on to chapter 14, the structure. Quote, the universe is information and we are stationary in it, not three-dimensional and not in space or time. Uh, and end quote. The code, the structure of the code, the structure of the code. The information fed to us, we hypostatize into the phenomenal world. End quote. Philip K. Dick Vallis. Man, Vallis is a trippy ass book. I tell you that for sure. Read that, I don't know, like 15, 20 years ago. Crazy ass book. The code generates the hypergrid, which instantiates the information from which all emerges in this reality. Everything is a manifestation of the complexification of information. The complexification of information. In our effort to understand the nature of reality within which we are embedded, we are now ready to strip away that last layer of conceptualization to arrive at the true structure of the hypergrid, pure digital information generated by the code. When discussing the grid, we have used cellular automata as exemplifying, exemplifying, did I say exemplifying? Exemplifying its essential features. A digital universe of connected cells updating their state with each click of time, based on the states of cells in their neighborhood. Further, we have always assumed, albeit implicitly, the spatial nature of a cellular automaton grid, where whether in two, three, or higher dimensions. How, for example, Conway's Game of Life is a two-dimensional digital universe, quote unquote, in which the infinite spatial extent of the grid seems to be fundamental to the structure of the automaton. Each cell has a particular spatial extent, a square area of the grid that it occupies, and complex structures emerge on this grid, extending infinitely in the four directions of the plane. Infinitely, you say? Hmm. There is a very specific reason for visualizing the game of life as a two-dimensional square grid. The state of each cell updates depending on the states of the 8 cells in its neighborhood, making a square grid the most natural way to represent the relationships between the cells. However, there is nothing in the construction of the game of life that requires it to be visualized in such a way. An alternative and much more flexible way of representing a cellular uh, automaton is to use a network of nodes connected by edges instead of square cells connected side by side. A node performs the exact same role as a cell. In fact, they are fundamentally the same and can extend in a finite number of states, two in the case of the game of life, with the edges indicating the connectivity. The von Neumann neighborhood, for example, is a 1 to 4 pattern of connectivity. The central cell is connected to 4 surrounding cells, whereas the Moore neighborhood is 1 to 8. The standard grid representation of a cellular automaton doesn't indicate the neighborhood used in the transition rules, whereas this is made explicit in the equivalent network representation. Standard grid representation, node representation, von Neumann neighborhood. I mean, it's just pretty much the same thing. Node representation, more neighborhood. Yeah, all these grids kind of remind me of the Freemason, the Freemasonic checkerboard floor, you know, just a little bit. Seems kind of weird. Although certain ways of representing a cellular automaton might be preferred over others, there is actually no requirement for the automaton to be visualized at all. This is purely for enjoyment. So it's like, uh, We don't want to mistake the map for the territory kind of thing. Each cell in the game of life, for example, is not actually a square area of a grid, but simply a piece of information instantiated by some extract element that can switch between one of two states. In most cases, this element is a component of the computer chip responsible for storing the states of all the cells as the game runs. But coins, checker pieces, or squares of colored paper, or any things that can exist is in precisely two states, and thus each instantiate a single bit of information, are equally valid, albeit rather impractical, substitutes for the internal states of a computer microprocessor. The material used to represent the states of the cells is completely independent of the patterns of information generated by life as it runs. Chess is another game played on a square grid. The pieces of a chessboard might uh, be elaborately curved from exotic hardwoods and are given fancy monikers like knight, bishop, or queen. Or a modern game of chess might be played entirely on an electronic device. Advanced players might even play out an entire game without ever looking at a board, but simply by recording their moves in algebraic chess notation. This, at its most stripped down level, the game of chess seems to be something much more abstract and fundamental than knights, bishops, and wooden boards. The game of chess is a mathematical structure, which we can define informally as a set of elements that with certain defined properties and relationships between each other. The term element is deliberately abstract in being a mathematical object with no physical or other types of characteristics other than those specifically given to it. Think of an element as an imaginary hook upon which we can hang whatever features we want or require. A Each piece in a game of chess is an element upon which certain characteristics are defined. How does the element move around the space defined by the board? How does the element interact with other elements? Once the specific characteristics of each element are defined, we can play chess on a board, on a computer, or by mailing our moves scribbled in chess notation back and forth across the world. The game, at its most fundamental, is independent of how we choose to represent it. Similarly, at its most fundamental level, the game of life is a mathematical structure consisting of a large number of elements together with a set of defined relationships between them. Each element is given two discrete states, only one of which can be occupied at any time, and the ability to receive information about the states of a well-defined selection of other elements, the neighborhood, and nothing more. As life runs, information is generated as every element updates its state in parallel, selecting from the two possible states based on its current state and those of its neighbors. For ease of visualization, we have used square cells to represent the elements and their states, but any set of objects, whether concrete or purely abstract, that preserve the relationships between the elements and is a perfectly equivalent representation of the game of life. So Cells on a square grid are no more a fundamental component of the game of life than bishops hand carved from Indian rosewood are a fundamental component of the game of chess. Our choice of representing the game of life is just that, a representation of something more abstract and fundamental. The essential features of the game of life are the possible states of each element, the way these elements are connected 1 to 8, and the update rules. None of these features require any sort of grid at all, as long as the defined relationships between the elements are maintained. Think we think of the game of life in its original form as being two-dimensional because of the way it is usually visualized using a two-dimensional square grid. However, of course, life can be run on a computer without ever plotting the output as a grid, network, or any other representation. In fact, we can choose to output the information generated by the game of life as binary code, as patterns of light or sound, or not at all. How we choose how we choose to represent the information generated by life has no bearing on the information itself, other than perhaps making it easier for us to interpret this information by observing patterns on a grid rather than trying to make sense of a string of binary digits. This naturally raises the question as to whether the game of life remains a two-dimensional cellular automaton, even if its output isn't visualized on a two-dimensional grid, if at all. To answer this question, we need to think a little more deeply about what we mean by space, quote unquote, and the varying dimensionalities that it can possess. The awareness of a three-dimensional spatial world is one of the most fundamental features of our experience, established from the earliest stages of our lives as we explored our environment and each developed our own unique phenomenal model of the world. Space seems absolutely fundamental to our existence, and it feels natural to assume that the ground of reality must have a spatial aspect. We intuitively think about space in terms of the relationships between objects within space rather than trying to envisage space itself. Space appears to be an empty container within which objects can be placed. However, space itself has a structure that emerges from something more fundamental. Like all things, barring the code itself, space is emergent. Mathematically, space is defined as a set of points together with a set so well, and then the headset conks out. Like I charge it every night. It's not an energy issue. It has plenty of juice in it. It's just I don't know if it's like the wireless connection just isn't perfect all the time, even though the USB port device that it broadcasts the wireless connection is like not even 2 feet away from me. So I don't know. Anyways, where was I? Space seems absolutely fundamental to our existence, and it feels natural to assume that the ground of reality must have a spatial aspect. We intuitively think about space in terms of the relationships between objects within space rather than trying to envisage space itself. Space appears to be an empty container within which objects can be placed. However, space itself, it has a structure that emerges from something more fundamental. Like all things, barring the code itself, space is emergent. I read all this, I'm sorry. Mathematically, space is defined as a set of points together with a set of relationships between the points known as a topology. Yes, that's the points and the relationship between them. Most of us are familiar with what is known as the Euclidean or standard topology, which in its one-dimensional form, one space, is a simple line formed from an infinite number of points, like beads on a thread, each with precisely two neighbors. As with a cellular automaton, the points surrounding a point form around a point form its neighborhood. One space, doopy doop. Generating two-dimensional space, two space, is as straightforward as extending the one-dimensional line by adding a second orthogonal line. Two space, we got the grid, two-dimensional grid. And adding a third line generates the three-dimensional space that feels so natural and obvious when we think of space. Using the one-dimensional standard topology to build increasingly higher dimensional topologies is a common way of building such spaces in mathematics, and there is nothing stopping us adding a fourth, fifth, or even more dimensions to the familiar standard three space by adding more and more orthogonal one-dimensional lines. Although such dimensionality is difficult to visualize, there is nothing mathematically unusual about extending Euclidean space in this way. The dimensionality of a space simply corresponds to the number of independent coordinates required to specify the position of a point in that space. The topology of a space describes the connectivity between those points, or equivalently, the topology defines the space of the shape of the space. The standard topology is the easiest to visualize, extending infinitely and uniformly along each of its dimensions, but an infinite range of spatial topologies can be constructed, from the familiar to the exotic, unexpected, and unimaginable. For example, one can take a finite square of the standard two-space topology, a simple two-dimensional plane, roll it into a cylinder, and then bend the cylinder round to join end to end. This creates a torus. Oh, I was just watching this in a freaking Library of the Untold video. I think might be talking about something different though. This creates a torus or donut, which defines a two-dimensional topology in many ways, similar to the standard two-space topology. I keep wanting to say typology, but it's not. It's topology, not topology. Except the relationships between the points on the topology are different. In the standard topology, the points extend infinitely in each of the two dimensions, but on a torus, moving along either dimension will eventually bring you back to where you started. The same can be said for the surface of a sphere, another very familiar two-dimensional topology. Topologies can be defined in any finite or infinite dimensional space, but many of these can only be grasped in complete abstraction. The important idea is that the relationships between the points of a space, whatever its dimensionality, are defined mathematically and can be uh, encoded. You don't need a donut to define a donut topology. I kind of want a donut though. Keep talking about donuts, man. A nice chocolate donut. Uh, God damn, where am I? Donut topology. And of course, a cellular automaton is simply a set of elements or points together with the set of defined relationships between them. In other words, a cellular automaton defines a topology of space as a space. The dimensionality of an automaton's topology is not dependent on how it is represented on a grid or not at all, but is intrinsically defined by its connectivity. So the game of life is two-dimensional because of the connectivity of its encoded elements, cells slash nodes, not because of the conventional choice to represent it on a square grid. Each cell of this 4 by 4 grid can be fully represented by three integers. The first two represent its position on the grid, one for each dimension, and thus its relationship to its neighbors, and the third represents its state, one or two. The entire grid can thus be represented as a string of 48 integers. Uh, and all this, I don't know why there's 4 in there. I thought it was just ones and zeros, at least for binary code anyway. Oh, brother. T0, T1, T2, T3. There's different states. Only the grid representation clearly reveals a dynamic pattern of information we know as a glider. However, both representations of entirely equivalent and are entirely equivalent and contain the same information. A little bit distracted, but um, the properties and information patterns generated by the game of life, including the dimensionality and topology of its space, are completely independent of how or whether we might choose to display this information as a two-dimensional grid network of nodes or as a binary string. A two-dimensional grid is merely a convenient way for us to visualize the information generated by life from the outside. It's important that we don't erroneously think of the spatial topology of life as somehow being a representation of space in the way that an architect's computer model of a house is a representation of its three-dimensional structure. In a cellular automaton, the topology encoded by the relationships between its cells is the actual space. The To appreciate this, we can reposition ourselves not as outside observers, but as complex critters that emerge inside the game of life. Pause. Okay, where was I? Game of life. Assuming that conscious beings might eventually emerge in a cellular automaton running on a computer. As one of these emergent critters, you would experience a reality with, excuse me, I'm hiccuping, Excuse me. I don't know what's going on. Uh, as one of these emergent critters, you would experience a reality with a dimensionally commensurate with the topology defined as uh, the automaton. What is the rest of this word? What is going on here? I'm guessing that's supposed to be automaton, but I don't know what happened. The dimensionality and spatial quality of your phenomenal world would be determined by the connectivity of the cells as the game runs, or or equivalently, the connectivity of the cells would define a topology that you would experience as your space. In the same way we experience our usual three-dimensional world outside of the game. Looking around, you would notice that each point in the space was connected to 8 other points, and that traveling between points required you to cross a specific number of other points. Whether or not the output of the automaton was displayed on a convenient screen for the viewing pleasure of humans outside the game, excuse me, would be entirely irrelevant to your experience as a conscious being inside the game. Kind of reminds me of the Truman Show a little bit. Of course, this also applies to automata of higher dimensionality. A conscious critter that emerges inside a nine-dimensional cellular automaton would experience a type of nine-dimensional space that we would have no way of ever comprehending without entering it. And likewise, this applies to our reality. Although the discrete points that comprise our reality, the grid, are too small for us to observe directly, we appreciate and experience the gross features and qualities of our three-dimensional spatial topology. Some of these features we can point out and measure, such as the three orthogonal directions of space and the distances between objects. However, our experience of three-dimensional space is largely ineffable. Pause. Like the quality of the color red, and can only be understood by being experienced. This is why, no matter how intellectually or mathematically prepared one might be, tumbling into DMT hyperspace space is thoroughly confounding. There is no way to anticipate the quality of a space before one enters it, nor indeed is it easy to render the space in the memory once one returns, other than perhaps a three-dimensional projection or approximation, which perhaps partly explains the frustration commonly experienced in trying to recall details of the DMT state. Well, isn't that unfortunate? So, the code is a structure of unknown and irrelevant dimensionality that encodes the finite states of the discrete elements slash nodes slash cells of the grid, together with the connectivity between them in much the same manner that the binary code inside a computer generates, stores, and updates the states of the cells in the game of life. There is no fundamental spatial aspect to the grid. The connectivity between the elements slash nodes slash cells is encoded by the fundamental rule set and defines the dimensionality and topology of the space that emerges as the code generates the grid, and ultimately defines the quality of the space experienced by self-reflective conscious organisms that eventually emerge within the grid, including ourselves. Since an alien hyperintelligence was responsible for generating the code, and since the code generates the hypergrid, it is tempting to conclude that we are the products of some kind of intelligent design. But this is not the case, for the code doesn't only generate the grid upon which we define ourselves, but all possible grids. So, like a multiverse, multiple universes? Chapter 15, How to Build a Universe. Our universe is a lower dimensional slice, the grid, of a higher dimensional system, the hypergrid, which is generated by a fundamental code. Although the code was generated by an alien intelligence outside the hypergrid, we are not designed. When John Conway originally encoded the Game of Life, he had no idea that the program, when run, would exhibit such rich complexity. He happened to stumble upon one of the few rule sets that spawn a cellular automaton with interesting behavior. For any particular type of automaton, there is a finite, albeit potentially extremely large, number of possible rule sets, which form the rule space. Every rule set within the rule space will display behavior somewhere along the continuum of type 1 homogeneity to type 3 chaos, with just a few sitting in that narrow type 4 band between order and chaos, where complex, stable structures emerge. The edge of chaos, as he said earlier in the book, I believe. So, life, how does one go about finding a cellular automaton with complex, open-ended behavior that might eventually harbor living organisms? There seems to be no simple way of knowing whether any particular rule set will engender the type of structures with the potential to complexify towards conscious life. Running the program is the only sure test. Building a universe within which complex life will emerge is as easy as finding the right rule set, and as hard. Kind of reminds me of that one video, one song, music video, kind of, where it's featuring Carl Sagan. And I think one of the first lines he says is, if you wish to make an apple pie from scratch, you must first invent the universe. What was the name of that video? I forget. It's gonna be like Carl Sagan, 400 billion suns, or Carl Sagan something or other. It's like a person, I forget who it was, but they put together audio quotes, video snippets of Carl Sagan saying a bunch of things, and basically makes it into a song. Whoop is like one of the little like sound effects in the song. But anyways, cellular automata exemplify the idea that simple code, when executed, can generate behavior that is startlingly complex and thoroughly unpredictable. This is the game of life written in the ultra concise APL language. Uh, oh brother, I don't know any of that. Like some of these symbols I have never even seen before. maybe some Greek symbols. I think that's omega. That's phi, I think. Exponential, exponential. I think that's the upward arrows, exponential, whatever. Anyways, I have no idea about that kind of code. Writing the code to enumerate all possible rule sets to generate every rule set within a rule space for a cellular automaton is fairly straightforward. When we take a one-dimensional elementary cellular automaton, for example, there are precisely 256 rule sets to iterate through. As the size of the neighborhood and dimensionality of the automaton increases, the size of the rule space expands rapidly. But crucially, however large it may grow, it will always remain finite. And with sufficient computing power, the entire rule space can be explored exhaustively, even though the type of system that forms the basis of our universe grid. A larger rule space doesn't mean that more complex code is required to enumerate through it, only that the output and the time and requisite computational resources will be much larger. Crucially, it will always be easier and computationally cheaper to run every possible automaton, every possible grid, than to attempt to determine a priori the rule sets that will produce the type of behavior one hopes will emerge. However, it isn't necessary to run every rule set until it either does or doesn't yield living organisms. Experience will indicate that certain patterns of behavior are in an early grid universe tend to augur the eventual emergence of complex life, whereas other patterns preclude it. Grids with such potential can be selected, whilst those that fail to display such behavior are halted. Game over. Naturally, a great deal of intelligence and experience will be required to distinguish grids with such potential from those destined for either endless homogeneity or a ceaseless tumult of structureless chaos. However, the decision to either keep a grid running or to halt it can usually be made early. Once a universe emerges with apparently intelligent, conscious life, it it's natural it it is natural to wonder what one might do with such a universe, or indeed with the conscious intelligences emergent within it. Broadly, there are two options. Leave the universe alone, do not intervene or interfere in any way, which kind of sounds like deism, or intervene in and or interact with the universe in some way towards some end, which sounds like, other religions. If the former approach is taken, the intelligences within the universe will presumably forever remain ignorant of their status as part of an encoded emergent reality. However, it's possible that a sufficiently advanced intelligence might eventually reach a level of cognitive and scientific sophistication such that their status is suspected and potentially tested. Indeed, within our civilization, there already exists a clutch of plucky philosophers and physicists that have proposed ways of testing whether or not we live in a simulated reality, quote unquote. And Bostrom has entered the chat, among others. This terminology is avoided here. Thank you, since it presumes that a reality constructed from digital information must be simulated, whereas in fact our universe is an instantiation of a reality rather than a simulation of one. In the case of our grid, its ultimate purpose is the game, which involves conscious intelligences interacting with, interfacing with the hypergrid. We will deal with the detailed nature of the game and how we can play it in the final chapter. For now, having developed a deep understanding of the structure of our reality, the grid, and how it was generated from the code, together with what we have learned about how the flow of information between dimensions of the hypergrid is controlled, we can begin to understand how and why DMT has the special property of gating information flow from the hypergrid's normally hidden dimensions into the human brain. Although there are certain universal features of conscious self-reflective information complexes, brains, that emerge on our grid, there is no simple way to plug, quote unquote, such a complex into the hypergrid. Imagine programming and running a simulated world on a computer sitting on your desk. To your astonishment, complex living forms begin to emerge within the digital world, living beings that eventually begin displaying signs of conscious intelligence. After some time, you decide it's time to try and communicate with these beings, perhaps even attempt to connect them to our 3D world so they can experience our reality. How would you go about this? Hmm, this is not a trivial problem. Since their lower level dimensional world is completely alien to our higher dimensional container reality, you might perhaps try and identify their brain complex and input information. But even if you were successful in injecting information into their brain complex, it's certain that it would make no sense to them whatsoever. Unlike such a computer simulation, the structure of the grid is such that it is set up from its inception to receive information from the higher dimensional reality. Being a dimensional slice of the hypergrid, it is already fundamentally connected to it in the same way that a 2D slice is connected to a 3D cubic cellular automaton. However, the grid is informationally isolated from the hypergrid, since its cell states are insensitive to dimensions beyond the three dimensions of the slice. Beep boop code. Although from our perspective, the grid is isolated from the hypergrid in that no information flows from the hypergrid to the grid, all of the information generated by the grid, indeed the hypergrid, is available to alien hyperintelligence that generated the code. This means the grid can be analyzed for the characteristically complex patterns of information generated at the level of the grid by emergent brain complexes, native brain patterns, see chapter 11. Once these patterns and thus potentially conscious intelligences are identified, the task is to generate the pattern rule mappings that will gate the flow of information from the hypergrid into the brain. However, as explained in Chapter 11, native brain patterns are not used for these mappings since they would result in hyperdimensional information flooding the brain at all times. Excuse me. Rather, modified patterns of activity, perturbation brain patterns, are employed. These are highly specific patterns of information that result from the modulation of brain activity by a very particular external information complex, which in our case takes the form of DMT. When DMT floods the brain, the patterns of information it generates are dramatically altered, And as this modified information flows downwards to the level of the grid, it is altered cell slash node patterns that are mapped to the rule set that allows 4+ input states to emerge, thus gating the flow of information from the hypergrid into the brain. Beep boop. It is natural to wonder why DMT and DMT only has this special role as the information gatekeeper. And this will become clear when we discuss the nature of the game in detail in the final chapter. As at this point, it is sufficient to understand that DMT is, in a sense, an intelligence test. Whilst it would be straightforward for the author of the code to map our native brain patterns to the appropriate rules and plug us into the hypergrid at will, it is an important part of the game that we plug ourselves into the hypergrid. DMT is the plug, the channel switch that must not only be identified as such, but must be also let me hold on a second here. But must be also be isolated. That's a little. I don't think we need the second B, in my opinion. But must be also isolated or synthesized in a reasonably pure form and the most effective mode of administration found. And this requires considerable intelligence and could not be achieved by a creature with only a primitive intellect. No, understanding and using DMT as a technology, and a technology it is, requires a level of cognitive sophistication that has, so far, found an earthly expression only in humans. Elephants, monkeys, and other beasts might well chew upon psychoactive leaves or munch wind or munch wind-fallen and sun-fermented berries, only humans possess the intelligence and the technical acumen to use DMT. On Earth, at least, so far, only the human can pass the test. The code. Implementation of the code. Implementation of the code. We got G, A, G, B, G, C. Grid A, grid B, grid C, perhaps? Hypergrid is the whole thing. Running the code generates the hyperdimensional hypergrid and a vast number of lower dimensional grid slices. Only 3 are shown. Within one of within one of which we find ourselves emergent. Oh no, emergence, raw. Before discussing the nature of the game and its resolution discussed so far, the preceding chapters were very much a prerequisite. We live in a reality constructed from digital information instantiated by a code programmed by an alien hyperintelligence, the other, as he designates it, for lack of a better designation, I guess. The code programs the structure of our reality as a digital object constructed as one of a vast number of lower dimensional slices, grids, of a structure known as the hypergrid. The grid and the hypergrid is encoded as a network of fundamental cells slash nodes connected according to a rule set. This connectivity allows information to flow between cells slash nodes, excuse me, and throughout the hypergrid. However, the flow of information between the grid and the hypergrid is normally restricted using 3 input cell slash node states insensitive to the orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid. The cells slash nodes with their connectivity form a spatial topology that determines the dimensionality of the space that emerges as the grid runs. Between being within a lower dimensional slice of the hypergrid, emergent organisms such as ourselves experience a space within a commensurately lower dimensionality than beings emergent in the hypergrid. Even the most complex structures that appear in our world and others can be seen to emerge through many layers of hierarchical complexity, from the hypergrid to the subatomic to the or, organismic level. This includes the brain complex, which is built from information and is extremely complex information and is an extremely complex information generator. Everything is a manifestation of the complexification of information. He, he loves that complexification of information. Where is the That's a period right there, so I don't know if this is a typo or what, but in detail, it makes sense to review the uh, main concepts, preparation for the following, and their understanding. This seems like a sentence fragment. What is going on here, unless that's on purpose? Like a fragment of code or something? Like the complexification of information can also lead to fragmentation because nothing is perfect, perhaps. Information is dynamic and flows through the hypergrid, both within organizational layers and between them. The upwards and downwards flow of information is crucial for the self-organization of complex including living systems. As brain complexes emerge and evolve, they eventually construct a model of reality experienced as a phenomenal world. This subjective world is built from vast amounts of information which the brain generates by selecting T states from an astronomical number of potential states. Psychedelic molecules modify the information generated by a brain, modifying the structure and dynamics of its phenomenal world. The key requirement for transport to an alternate orthogonal dimension of the hypergrid is the transfer of information from normally hidden dimensions into the brain complex. This is achieved using pattern rule mappings that map the perturbations perturbation patterns generated by the brain in the presence of DMT to rules that engender the emergence of cell/node states sensitive to these higher dimensions that gate the flow of information from the hypergrid into the brain. Once information begins flowing from orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid into the brain complex, upwards and downwards information flow establishes a feedback loop that locks the brain complex in the higher dimensional state, building hyperspace until DMT is removed from the brain. And there's a period there that doesn't seem to. Anyways, quote. Maybe this is not uh, maybe this is not actually a reality. We are trapped, or I'm trapped. I don't know if you're trapped, but we're in some kind of piece of fiction. It's like a Philip K. Dick deal. We're in some kind of simulacrum. End quote. Apologies. Terrence McKenna. And I guess we got all these red lines. Chapter 16, the game. I believe this is the final chapter, so we might as well get through it. How are we doing? We're actually doing pretty good. So yeah, we can finish this up. The task of the game is to realize the nature of our imprisonment in the grid and to find our way out. But a game it is. The game has 6 levels, the final being resolution, which involves the transcription of the brain complex and permanent transference into the hypergrid. Permanent transference. Level 1, information. Level 2, emergence. Level 3, transmission. Level 4, immersion. Level 5, realization. Level 6, resolution, transcription. Levels 1 and 2, information and emergence. These first 2 levels are simply the process by which the grid engenders conscious intelligences. The code generates countless variations of the grid, only a handful of which will result in the emergence of complex, intelligent beings. These grids evolve independently of the hypergrid according to their own particular variant of the fundamental rule set dictated by the code. All of these grid variants must either grind down to endless homogeneity or convulse towards a maelstrom of ceaseless chaos. A few, however, self-complexify towards the emergence of complex living organisms and ultimately, excuse me, and ultimately to conscious intelligences. However, no matter how complex an organism might become, Without in, without intervention, it will always remain independent of the hypergrid, embedded in its isolated dimensional slice, the grid upon which it emerged. The emergence of a conscious intelligence within a grid can be detected by the specific, highly complex patterns of information generated by brain complexes. However, such patterns do not establish the level of intelligence required for transference into the hypergrid. Once potential conscious intelligences are detected and selected as potential candidates for the game, a technology must be embedded in the grid that will not only gate the flow of information from the hypergrid into the brain complex, but will also provide a test of sophisticated high-level intelligence. This technology is DMT. Level 3, Transmission. The primary role of the DMT technology is to elicit highly characteristic patterns of brain. That's number 2 for the headset, sad trombone. The primary role of the DMT technology is to elicit highly characteristic patterns of brain activity that will cause the adoption of specific cell/node patterns at the level of the grid. This perturbation brain patterns, these perturbation brain patterns, say that 5 times fast, sheesh, can be used to generate the pattern rule mappings that will engender the emergence of 4+ input cell/node states inside the brain complex and thus gate the flow of information from orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid into the brain. However, this interdimensional information flow into the brain complex is not sufficient for entry into hyperspace. Recall that switching from consensus reality to the DMT reality requires not only the gating of information from these orthogonal dimensions, but also that this information is matched to the ongoing intrinsic information being generated by the brain. Excuse me. So, DMT triggers the initial change in brain activity that gates transdimensional information flow. But this modified activity must be structured such that it can be further modulated by the information received from these orthogonal dimensions. And as with sensory information received via the usual sensory apparatus, it is the connectivity of the brain which must be sculpted to absorb the extra dimensional information as it flows upwards from the level of the hypergrid. In other words, just as with the consensus world, the brain must learn to build a model of the hypergrid such that in the presence of DMT, the activity of the thalamocortical system matches the information being received from the hypergrid, and the brain builds a model of its structure experienced as hyperspace. This is achieved using a transmission priming, quote unquote, phase of the game, which molds the connectivity of the thalamocortical system and without which the lock phase of the DMT breakthrough process, see chapter 13, could never be achieved. During this transmission phase, high levels of DMT are present in the brain, which receives a stream of information from the hypergrid and essentially learns to construct a model of its structure. See Chapter 7 for details on the mechanism. Unless this priming transition phase is completed, even though information might be gated into the brain complex in the presence of DMT, owing to the encoded pattern rule mappings, the higher dimensional information will fail to modulate cortical activity and to achieve the lock phase of the DMT breakthrough process. So that may be what you could say is the lockout that people talk, the DMT lockout that people talk about, because it's not completing that transition phase. It's not um, it failed to modulate cortical activity to achieve the lock phase for the breakthrough process. You can also think of this as a kind of tuning phase. The initial pattern rule mappings gate information into the brain complex whenever DMT is present. But this stream of information from the hypergrid gradually modifies the connectivity of the thalamocortical system, further enhancing the brain's activity to absorb information from the orthogonal dimensions. In Chapter 5, we described this as an increase in the mutual information between the brain and the environment, and the same applies in the presence of DMT, except the increase in mutual information is between the brain and the orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid. The transmission phase occurs in the prenatal brain as the fetus is developing inside the womb. DMT levels are markedly and consistently high in the fetal brain, but begin to fall at birth until only a few months into the postnatal life, DMT levels drop to trace levels. Although explicit memories aren't laid down during this time, the sense of deja vu that accompanies many DMT trips is likely a result of these prenatal sojourns in hyperspace. This is also why elves often welcome the tripper back with great celebratory uproar, and indeed there is cause for celebration, since the next tentative step towards the resolution phase has been taken. Many DMT users are struck by the unshakable feeling that their DMT trips carry them back to where they resided before they were born. Hmm, interesting. And indeed, soon after the development of the brain inside the womb, DMT levels rise and the transmission phase begins. So the prenatal brain complex begins receiving information from the orthogonal dimensions of the hypergrid throughout prenatal development. It is only after birth that DMT levels in the brain begin to wane, serotonin regains full control, and the child becomes fully immersed in the consensus world, receiving information only from the dimensionally limited grid. So, no, so newborn children are ferried from a prenatal hyperspace to the lower dimensional life they will gradually become immersed within. So, to lose any explicit memory of the luminal realms from whence they came. Now we have maybe a more scientific sort of explanation of people that have pre-birth memories, or at least claim to have these pre-birth memories, to be more precise, I suppose. Level 4, immersion. The immersion phase, like the subsequent realization phase, can be seen to occur at both the individual level over a lifetime, from birth until death or resolution, and at the societal level over evolutionary epochs. Until a species until a species reaches a level of cognitive and technological advancement such that the DMT technology is discovered and developed, the phase we are in now, all humans are destined for full immersion in the grid from birth until death. This is an important phase since it allows the brain complex to evolve and mature, and for the requisite intellectual and technical capacities to fully develop before realization is possible. It should also be pointed out that these phases run somewhat in parallel. Excuse me. The transmission phase is still occurring during the immersion phase, whereas the former occurs on the prenatal side of life and the latter only after birth. At the species level, immersion can be seen simply as the gradual evolution of the human brain complex over many millennia, embedded, immersed in the grid, isolated from the hypergrid. In a sense, all beings with some level of intelligence and conscious of self-awareness are in an immersion phase, in that they are immersed in the grid, but the vast majority will never progress beyond it. And although humans separated from other apes a few tens of millennia ago, we have only very recently transcended the invisible line separating those ever destined to wriggle in the dust from those with a shot at hyperspace. Level 5, realization. The DMT technology only takes up its role as an quote intelligent test end quote at level 5, realization, at which point it relies on human intelligence for its administration. Realization is both a process of realizing the nature of the game and of finding a way out of it using the embedded DMT technology. It is a fundamentally requisite feature of the technology that its administration cannot be accidental or the result of normal feeding or exploration of the environment. Rather, it must be sought, identified, and a proper technique for its usage developed, requiring of a highly sophisticated intelligence. As with the previous phase, the realization phase occurs at both the individual and societal, cultural level. Why don't I just use AL instead of O? Societ, societal, cultural level, since whilst the individual is capable of achieving realization of his nature as being imprisoned in the grid, the process of discovering and utilizing the technology for transcending it occurs over generational timescales. We can observe this process in our civilization from the discovery of DMT as the active component of indigenous Amazonian medicines to its synthesis and purification, most recently through the range of techniques for its efficient administration that have been developed largely by a spirited and enterprising clandestine psychedelic chemistry community. It's one way to put it. However, realization also occurs in the individual, often within seconds of the first ever DMT hit, as an earth-shattering Kensho-like experience of epochal proportions, both inexpressible and undeniable, often irretrievable, but almost always irreversible. In terms of the requisite intelligence, the gulf between the the casual consumption of a natural psychedelic, pause, throat scratchy, itchy, for some reason. All this talking, I guess. Let's finish this up. The gulf between the did it again, the casual consumption of a natural psychedelic such as psilocybe mushrooms during feeding and the deliberate administration using specialized techniques of highly purified DMT is vast and can only be traversed by an intelligence of prodigious dimensions and depth. Of course, as bearers of such intelligence, it's somewhat difficult to appreciate just how remarkable is the gelatinous structure that has emerged within this particular hominid's skull. The human species has undoubtedly progressed to this realization phase, within which we continue to advance, albeit in fits and starts and suppressed by a powerful but ignorant and benighted few. The elites, we don't talk about those. The psychedelic effects of DMT were discovered in 1956, synthesized by Hungarian physician and chemist Stephen Zara, I don't know if that's how you pronounce it, but who was seeking support for his hypothesis that DMT, not bufotenine, is that like what they call bufo? Probably not, was responsible for the psychoactive effects of the Amazonian cohoba snuff. It wasn't until the invention of chromata, chromat, chromatography. I don't know why I'm struggling with that one. I shouldn't be. Chromatography at the beginning of the 20th century that isolation and purification of DMT from plant materials became possible. Synthetic organic chemistry, that seems like a oxymoron, kind of. Synthetic organic chemistry was similarly in its infancy at this time, and the first synthesis of DMT wasn't published until 1931. Although a variety of modern synthetic routes to DMT have since been developed, including the Speeder Anthony synthesis used by Zara, the very first was invented less than a century ago. Whether extracted from jojoba seeds or synthesized from simpler precursors, today, Junior, before the dawn of the 20th century, humans were literally incapable of progressing beyond the immersion phase of the game, demonstrating of the level of intelligence required. Having synthesized 10 grams of DMT tartrate, Zara's initial experiments ingesting the drug orally were unsuccessful. He swallowed increasing doses of the drug over several days up to around 3/4 of a gram, a massive dose, but with no effects whatsoever. Ready to give up on his ostensibly flawed hypothesis, a colleague suggested he try injecting it. Quote, in April of 2020, in April of 1956, I tested 3 doses intramuscularly, placed paced at least 2 days apart to allow the drug to clear my body. The first dose, 30 milligrams, around zero point 0.4 milligram per kilogram, um, elicited some mild symptoms, dilation of the pupils and some colored geometric forms with closed eyes were already recognizable. Encouraged by these results, I decided to take a larger dose, 75 milligrams, around 1.0 milligram per kilogram, something like that. We'll just say mg slash kg. Also intramuscularly. Within 3 minutes, the symptoms started, both the autonomic, tingling, trembling, slight nausea, increased blood pressure and pulse rate, and the perceptual symptoms such as brilliantly colored oriental motifs and later wonderful scenes altering very rapidly. End quote. Zara had discovered the secret, not only to the Cahoba snuff magic, but also, unbeknownst to him at the time, the secret to completing the game he didn't even know he was playing. Hmm. Zara also unwittingly took the first step in developing DMT as a technology regarding recognizing that DMT is inactive when ingested orally, but must be injected or, as would be discovered in the following decade, vaporized to unmask its extraordinary effects on consciousness. Owing to its simplicity, vaporization of free-base DMT, usually extracted from the root bark of the Brazilian perennial shrub Jurema preta, Mimosa hostilis. I'm sure if I'm pronouncing these words right. Remains the most popular mode of administration. For many, there is an attractive romanticism attached to the hand-blown glass pipe, hand-woven rugs, incense, and the other accoutrements of the modern psychonaut. But vaporization is merely a means of pushing open the doorway, peering through and gasping at the frightening other beyond the threshold before the door is sharply pressed shut again. Developing DMT as a technology for playing the game demands we bring our best tools to the table. Unlike the other classic psychedelics, psilocybin, LSD, mescaline, and their synthetic derivatives, DMT is unique in possessing a number of pharmacological peculiarities that mark it out as being special. Most notably, of course, is the extremely rapid onset and brevity of its effects. Following intravenous injection of the drug, the most efficient mode of administration, the effects are noted almost immediately, and full breakthrough into the DMT hyperspace occurs within 60 seconds. The Voyager will then remain in this space for around 5 minutes before being jolted back into the consensus world with only residual effects. 20 to 30 minutes later, the effects are fully resolved. Many are frustrated by this brevity, complaining of being dragged back from hyperspace. Just when the maelstrom was beginning to stabilize and the entities beginning to speak, although for most 5 minutes is quite long enough. But for those wanting to return to the DMT worlds in short order, DMT is has an additional unique characteristic: lack of subjective tolerance. Lack of subjective tolerance. Hmm. Again, unlike the other classic psychedelics, which display diminishing effects with closely spaced doses, DMT can be injected repeatedly without any loss of subjective potency. Regular DMT users typically abstain from the drug for at least a couple of weeks following a trip. Whilst this is partly as a means of allowing integration of the experience and avoiding negative after effects, attempting to repeat trip attempting a repeat trip the following day is likely to fail. LSD exhibits rapid and sustained subjective tolerance. Of course, since LSD binds tightly to the 5-HT2A receptor, the experience itself lasts for several hours, and the come down quote unquote phase is sustained. With DMT, the in stark contrast, the entry and exit from DMT hyperspace is clean and rapid, and as soon as the trigger returns, re-entry is as simple as injecting a repeat dose. The aim of the DMT technology and required for the resolution phase to be completed is not to provide a brief jolting sojourn in hyperspace. Rather, the goal is to establish extended and stable entry into the DMT space, a stabilized lock phase of the DMT breakthrough process. The unique pharmacological characteristics of DMT, rapid onset and clearance, brief effect, and lack of tolerance, mean that the hyperspace visitation needn't be so abruptly cut short. Hmm. Target controlled intravenous infusion represents the pinnacle of modern psychoactive drug administration technologies. A continuous but variable infusion of a drug into the blood, delivered by a programmable infusion device, with the goal of attaining and maintaining a specific concentration of drug within the brain, the target, over an extended period of time. Although a continuous infusion of DMT seems like a simple idea, the practicalities are complex. As soon as the drug is introduced into the body by intravenous injection, it is rapidly diluted and distributed by the blood. Although it reaches to the effect site, the brain, within seconds, it also equal, equilibrates to varying degrees with muscles, fats, and other soft tissues. Equilibrates, equilibrates, something like that. The elimination of the drug from the body also begins immediately by a combination of enzymatic transformation and excretion through the kidneys and by biliary system. A mathematical model that takes into account all these factors must be developed to regulate the infusion. The initial infusion rate must be high to overcome the brisk dilution and distribution of the drug in the circulatory system and tissues. Although the brain DMT concentration to surpass allowing the brain DMT concentration to surpass the threshold for breakthrough into hyperspace. However, this initially high rate must be gradually reduced to maintain a stable brain DMT concentration. If a high initial rate is maintained, the concentration of DMT in the brain will continue to rise to extreme levels and eventually the user will black out. Conversely, if the rate is reduced too much, the brain DMT levels will fall below the threshold, resulting in an early exit from hyperspace. To enter and maintain a stable state within the space, brain DMT levels must be held within this narrow concentration window at all times. This is a difficult task requiring a detailed and deep understanding of human physiology, pharmacokinetics, drug metabolism, and drug distribution, as well as individual idiosyncratic factors that can affect the behavior of DMT inside the circulatory system and brain. However, once the technology is mastered, an individual can be brought into the DMT space and held there for an indefinite length of time. Then and only then can the resolution phase 6 uh, phase be attempted. Row Phase 6 Resolution. Resolution is the last phase of the game, the final task, the completion of the great work of any intelligent species. Often echoed by Terence McKenna, Soviet rocket scientist Konstantin Tsiolkovsky said, quote, "A planet is the cradle of the mind, but one cannot live in a cradle forever." End quote. It is the task of all species that reach the requisite level of intelligence and technological acumen, a stage we are now close to attaining, to recognize when they have outgrown the cradle and to make preparations for its relinquishment. The resolution protocol is the first step in the final process by which humans will transition from lower dimensional emergent intelligences to become interdimensional citizens of hyperspace. Uh, an elf once told me, quote, "Minds are jewels. Minds must be mined," end quote. "How are the minds built?" I asked. Quote, "A mind cannot be built. You have to let minds build themselves, as jewels building themselves in the dark rock," end quote, he replied. And then, quote, "Then you retrieve them," end quote. Pause. The human mind is a unique and resplendent jewel emergent within the dark rock. Kind of reminds me of the dark crystal. Trial by stone. Trapped within our unique slice of the hypergrid, a mind to be mined by generating countless grid variants. The code engenders the emergence of countless minds, countless jewels to be mined. This is McKenna's work of art. With every emergent conscious intelligence, each new mind that succeeds in transcending the grid, there is a great celebration with shockwaves of laughter that ripple across its every dimension. Emergent within, trapped within our grid, we are one of those intelligences close to completing that final task. The final resolution phase, facilitated by the resolution protocol, is the transcription of the mind within the hypergrid, the informational structure of the brain complex, and thus the mind, is rebuilt inside the hypergrid and is no longer dependent on the presence of DMT. The temporary hyperdimensional brain complex becomes permanent. Excuse me. Resolution is the completion of the cosmic game, the shedding of our lower dimensional body, the final transcendence of our lower dimensional world, the final escape from the work of art. Once resolution is achieved, we will continue to exist as entities inside the hypergrid, and when voyagers from its lower dimensional slices burst into our marvelous hyperdimensional domain, we will be amongst the thronging elfin crowds cheering and welcoming them home. Listen, there's a hell of a good universe next door. let's go. E. Cummings, quote unquote, I guess. And that's the end of the book, I believe. Further reading. The books and articles below are by no means exhaustive, but selected to provide further details about the ideas discussed in the relevant chapters, uh, where specific scientific points and or quotes are made in the text. These are numbered within the text and can be found below. The page facing the contents contains a section of Java code implementing Conway's Game of Life, published at uh, algozome.com and all that. Access 31st of January 2019. Chapter 1, da da da. Let's just go to the last chapter because he's talking about this game, and I'm wondering what he has. What? Did I miss? Oh, wait, here it is, chapter 16. Let's see, J.M. Beaton, Morris, P.E. Morris, ontogeny of DMT, dimethyl articles, an article he did with some guy named D.P. Luke Strassman. Oh, is that Richard Strassman? I think that might be. Differential tolerance to biological and subjective effects for or closely spaced doses of DMT in humans. Well, that's the end of the book, and we got this crazy, mesmerizing pattern here. And that's the end. Okay, well, that covers that. Thoughts? I don't, um, he's very, um, what's the word I'm looking for? He's very lenient in using technical type of language. Whether that's inspired from actually being in the DMT hyperspace or not is, I'm sure that has an influence on all the verbiage he uses as DMT being a technology, and I guess this the quote unquote other that implemented the code to begin with. Um, where was I going with that? I mean, it's really easy, and he says as much. It's really easy to basically infer simulation theory um, from if you when reading through this book, and like one of the last chapters he um, kind of refutes that, and he's saying it's instantiated, not simulated. So there's that pause. Man, I am coughing tonight. But anyways, but Gallimore never really, I don't, he never, he doesn't really stop to question whether or not we should transcend, quote unquote, to these higher dimensional realms. Because you have this type of progress from lower dimensional and lower types of sentient life to higher and higher. So there's almost like a mythology of progress. via evolution. Pause. Unfortunately, I'm out of water to drink right now. I don't feel like going to get any. I mean, I can at least conceptually understand why he would want to quote unquote transcend to these higher dimensional realms because he's already he's already had a taste of them. So, but I'm not sure if that's the kind of route you really want to go. I mean, barring me actually experiencing it for myself, I can't really say for sure that, that it's like just totally deceptive in that you're actually getting more entrapped into the work of art, as Terence McKenna would say. He's couching in terms of like a type of liberation from the work of art, escaping, liberation, transcendence, all these different words to, I guess, make it attractive to escaping um, our present reality when that might not necessarily be the case. Like, he kind of makes it like that's the only way we ought to go, and whether that's the case or not, I don't know. What was the other thing I wanted to say? Hmm. I do have to say the book on a visual uh, perspective was one of the most. I think I said this when I started the book. Is that it's uh, kind of, I wouldn't say it's unique in the sense that he's got different kinds of shapes and colors and whatnot throughout the book, and some of it was a little bit annoying because I have my blue light blocker mode on, but it was somewhat visually appealing to make to change it up as it were instead of just having just a black and white text. And that's kind of, you know, the alluding to higher dimensions. So trying to make it visually appealing in a sense, even though it was kind of pixelated the whole time. Overall, it's still an interesting book because it kind of it's it makes one have to address whether reality is monistic or dualistic or pluralistic. Get for lack of a better term, I suppose. Because if it's monism versus rather than dualism, then saying that your brain switching from the one set of information to the other set of information, excuse me, that would imply a kind of dualistic nature to reality then, in the sense of us experiencing reality, I should say, a dualistic experience of reality in our phenomenal worlds because we're switching from the lower grid to the hypergrid, even though it's all part of the code. So you could say the monism is the code, whereas our experience of certain parts of the code seem to be dualistic. So whether that's a fair analogy or not, I'm not sure. But I think that's about it for me. Um, I enjoyed the book, even though I don't necessarily agree with everything. Uh, again, with the caveat that I actually had to experience DMT at least once or twice to see how to have a better picture of what he's talking about. But um, but even then, who knows? So I guess that's it for now, and hopefully figure out what I want to read next. Actually, I kind of do want to know what I want to read next, so you'll see.
Let those dirty beasts worship the mud now.